Hello students, today I am back with a new programming problem, that is to find greatest number in an array. So here we can take the elements of the array from the user, or we can pre-declare an array with and initialize it with some elements, some arbitrary elements. So here we would choose to initialize the array with some arbitrary elements. So first of all, let's say there is an array named arr, and as you might be knowing that we can declare an one-dimensional array and initialize it in the same line, in the same statement. In that case, we didn't have to specify the size of the array. The size of the array would be implicitly calculated by the number of elements which we specify in the initialization list, that is within the curly bracket. So let's say these are few elements which are there in the array. So these are few elements, and we have taken number of elements as 6. So the it is saying that implicitly the size of array is 6. Now let us go for the logic to find the greatest number from this array. So what we need to do is that we would take a separate variable, say greatest, and then we would initialize it with the first element of the array. Or for that matter, the initialization of this greatest variable can be done with any element of the array, and the logic would almost remain the same. So here, for simplicity, we have initialized the greatest element with the first element of the array. Now now our logic to find the greatest among all the elements of the array is, so we would compare this current greatest with all other elements of the array one by one in a sequential fashion. So greatest now contains 3, right? Then we would compare it with the second element of the array, and if second element of the array is greater than the current greatest element, that is 3, then we would update the greatest variable, otherwise we would keep it as it is. So see, the second element of the array is 6, right? And the greatest contains 3, that is the first element of the array. So definitely this is greater than the current value of greatest. So we update greatest with the second element of the array. Fine. Then the same process would be done with each of the elements of the array one by one. And whenever we find an element to be greater than the current value of greatest, we would update greatest variable, otherwise we would keep as it is and we would go to the next variable. So that is our logic. So let us write it down. So for comparing the value of greatest variable with all the elements of the array, we are going to write a loop. So for that I have declared a variable I, which I would use as loop variable, and as I have initialized the first element, the greatest variable with first element of the array, so I needn't have to compare it with the first element, right? We would start the comparison of the greatest variable with index 1. So for that I'd initialize the loop variable with 1, and then I'd go up to the last index of the array. So here we have 6 elements in total, so the last index is 5, and then I plus plus. Now I'll have to compare the value of greatest with ith element of the array. So in the first iteration, value of I is 1, so the element at index 1 is 6, right? In the second iteration, the value of I would become 2. So we want to compare the current value of greatest the element with the element which is at index 2. So this is what we are going to write here. So for comparison, we are going to use if statement, and we are going to compare the element at the ith position, which can be accessed by ARRI, and if it is greater than the current value of greatest, then we are going to update greatest. So we are going to update greatest. That means we have found a value which is greater than the current value of greatest, right? That is ARRI. And if this condition is not satisfied, we are not going to do anything with the greatest. The current value of greatest would remain as it is. Fine. So how is this going to work is we have initialized greatest with ARR 0. Now in this loop, at the first iteration, value of I is 1. So ARR 1 is getting compared with greatest. If it is greater than the current value of greatest, then we are updating greatest with ARR 1. If not, we are doing nothing to greatest. We are going to the next iteration when I would become 2. So ARR 2 would get compared with greatest, and if ARR 2 is greater than greatest, then greatest is getting updated with ARR 2. So this would go on up to the last element of the array, and after this loop, the value of greatest would give us the greatest element among all the elements of the array. So this we are going to print on the console. So the greatest element is %d. We could write a getch here for other IDs, but for code blocks it is not required because the output window remains stable, be visible even after the program has run. So there is no need of getch statement for code blocks ID. So we are skipping it. Now let us build and run it and see whether it is working fine or not, whether the answer that that this program displays is 67. As we can see, 67 is greatest among all the elements. So let us build and run it. So there is, I think, some syntactical error here. Yeah, so I've forgotten to write I here. Now let us build it once more. So now it has built correctly. It seems it has built correctly, and now it has run. The greatest element is 67, so our program has worked fine. Now a word about the initialization of the greatest element. So if you see, we have initialized it with ARR 0, and we have started our comparison of the greatest element with starting from index 1. We could have easily started the comparison from 0th element. There would have been no changes. As such, the output of the program would have not got affected because of this. So, and then we could have initialized the greatest variable with any element of the array. Even then, the output of the program wouldn't have got affected, and the logic would have been perfectly fine. So the initialization value didn't have to be the first element of the array. It can be any element of the array, but it has to be an element of the array. That is mandatory. And why that is mandatory, I'll show you in a minute. So let's say if I initialize it with the means the element at the third index, even then that is this one, even then the programming logic would be correct. So we are comparing it with starting from 0th index up to the last index, and in intermediate position we are also comparing it with 8. Fine. So this is not this is going to work fine. So still the answer is coming out to be correct. Now, had I not initialized this greatest variable with an element of the array, what would have happened? Let's say we initialize it with some static constant, say let's say 0. Fine. So would this work fine? So when we initialize it with 0, the greatest would get updated at the first comparison itself, right? So the greatest would contain, after the first iteration, the greatest would contain 3, because 3 is greater than 0. So ARR 0 would be found as greater than um, the current value of greatest at the first iteration, which is 0, and then greatest would get updated with 3, right? From there on it would work perfectly fine. So let us check it. So currently we have initialized the greatest variable with 0 and it is working fine also. So what is the problem with this kind of initialization? That is with some constant value. So there is a subtle problem here. Let's say all the elements of the array are negative, say -3, -6, -67, -8, -20, and let's say here we have -10. Fine. So here we have -10. All the elements of the array, chosen array, is say negative. Now would it work fine? So 0 would be first compared with -3. Fine. So as -3 is lesser than the value 0, so greatest would remain as it is. Then the value of greatest, that is 0, would be compared with -6, so still the greatest value would be 0. Then greatest value 0 would again be compared with -67, so still 0 is greater, so greatest would remain as it is. Then it would be compared with -8, -20, -10, and the greatest would not get updated anytime, and it would remain 0 even after the loop is complete, and the value that would get printed would be 0. Let us check it. So the greatest element is 0, which is incorrect because the greatest element here is -3, right? -3 is the greatest element among all the elements of this. So the initialization with some constant value is incorrect because it is a bug that if all the elements of the array is lesser than the element with which the value with which the greatest variable got initialized, then the answer, the value that would be displayed as greatest is the initialization value, which would be incorrect, right? So that's why I said that it is mandatory that we initialize the greatest element, the greatest variable, with one of the elements of the array. And which one, it is not it would not matter. We can initialize the greatest variable with any element of the array, right? So here at the beginning we initialized with the 0th element of the array, and then we started comparison from the first index. So we can start comparison with from 0 index as well, doesn't matter. So -3 is our answer, which is correct. Fine. So -3 is the greatest element in this array. So with that we have completed our program, and I hope you have enjoyed this video, and more such programming problems I'd keep bringing up to you, and then we'll discuss those programming problems in our next videos as well. Thank you.